With the global economy already navigating through post-pandemic reconstruction, supply chain realignments, and rising geopolitical tensions, the recent wave of US tariffs has reignited debates on the future of free trade. Unlike earlier tariff phases, this moment comes against a backdrop of strategic decoupling with China, growing protectionist sentiments in advanced economies, and pressure on developing countries integrated in the global value chains. Hello and a very warm welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us in Geopolitics Decoded for what promises to be a very insightful and timely conversation on recent US tariffs. Today, I'm privileged of speaking with Professor Deepanshu Mohan, Professor of Economics and Dean of IDAS at OP Jindal Global University. Professor Mohan's research spans comparative political economy, development studies, and economic anthropology. Sir, we are privileged and very happy to have you. Looking back at the smooth Hawley tariffs of the 1930s and Trump's tariffs on China and rather the rest of the world, do the current US tariff measures repeat past mistakes, or do they mark a very fundamentally different strategy this time around?
Okay, first of all, thank you for having me here. So the Smooth Hawley Tariff Act that was levied by the Hoover administration at that time was targeted on mostly Latin American agricultural imports, and the purpose of those were done because the Great Depression and the crisis of the Depression had affected the US economy, and there was primarily a jobs crisis that had happened, which had made the US government quite wary of its exposure to international markets. So the Smooth Hawley Tariff Act was a sort of an immediate crisis response to the nature of the stock market crash, banking crisis. Okay. Unlike what we are seeing right now, because there was no crisis, or there was no response to a crisis with what the Trump administration did. Mm-hmm. There's something far more ideological about the Trump administration advocating for bringing back jobs to Americans. Mm-hmm. It's been part of Trump's political agenda for very long. But the weaponization of tariffs as a political tool of leverage is very new. This has not been something that has been done in the past, because tariffs are seen as trade instruments which regulate prices of goods that are being imported into a market. But if you really see what tariffs do, is that they increase the cost of imports into your market. So it becomes difficult for me to now have a product sold in the domestic market because the cost of importing increases, which means that as a producer, as a distributor, I will pass off the cost to the consumer. So the prices of certain goods in the American market, particularly consumer durables, which were being imported from many markets in Asia or parts of what you would say Latin America, like Brazil, where there are high tariffs imposed, any import of that product would cost more in the US market. And that doesn't do any good to anyone. I mean, the economic logic on this is bizarre. So that has to be put in perspective. The Smooth Hawley Tariff Act also was very regressive. It took the US and much of the, I would say, transatlantic and European belt into a deeper recession. Europe became more protectionist as a result of the Americans inhibiting Latin America. Latin America went into a phase in the 1930s towards what was seen as left-wing extreme populism, which is authoritarian rise of individual leaders, because the shutting of the American markets, the US markets, affected the Latin American economies in the worst possible way. They were very much integrated with the US markets. So in the sense of understanding what Trump is doing now, there is no precedence in history of the actual same sequence of events. What it does reflect, however, is a situation of the end of the wave of globalization that started in the early 90s and the end of the multilateral trade order that we saw and we knew of.
Right. So that brings me to this question that are these tariffs less about economic logic but rather about US imposition as geoeconomic dominance, particularly in China and rest of the emerging countries' economies?
Absolutely. I mean, so this is entirely power play. The US hegemonic agenda in the international geopolitics and geoeconomic landscape has been one of establishing dominance over other countries. Over the last few decades, with the rise of China, the world has become increasingly bipolar in the sense of its sort of international outlook. But there is no economic logic to introduction of tariffs as a way of getting or bringing jobs back. Having said that, there is some precedence which is often called in economics as the infant industry argument, where certain industries are not exposed to greater trade, and you protect them as much as possible. Like I can give you the example from India. Our textile sector has been not exposed to external competition for much of the decades in post-independent India. Clearly because our textile sector is very vulnerable, there's not a lot of capital, and if you were to allow free entry of international companies, the small entrepreneurs or small enterprises working on textile across different regions, the rural artisans, that space would be completely impacted. So you have certain spaces and sectors where protection measures have worked, but to do the tariffs the way that they have been done in the American context and just to blanketly put a reciprocal tariff on each country which is trading in the US, there's no precedence of that or no economic logic.
Right. Speaking of Global South, what should India do? Should India align closer with the US, or should it push for a stronger Global South partnership so as to counterbalance this?
So of course, I mean, pushing for a realignment in its own trade policy would be what India want to do, and I think it's already making efforts. You have now the Prime Minister visiting China. There are 2 dialogues already as part of the SSIS summit, but it's also not going to be very easy for India. It's been trying to assert its position as part of many plurilateral, multilateral relationships, but India's presence and relevance, I mean, the point that I've been a little bit more critical of is that India's posturing and projection versus its actual relevance in international trade markets is very different. It is not as competitive in its products. One big market that you can understand is Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia consumes a lot of consumer durables, but 90% of those products are all coming from China. Where India has a comparative advantage has been in services like IT, fintech, and even those markets have not integrated much with what you're defining as the Global South network. So my sense is that while India may strategically want to realign, what really matters for India in the next 3 to 5 years is a reimagined industrial policy which is targeted for greater expansion or integration with these markets, what you're defining as the identity of the Global South, which is where I felt BRICS is a good space. You have CPTPP. That's a very interesting, I think, combined for India to be part of. We should renegotiate probably looking at our partnership and entry into RCEP, which we sort of failed to sort of sign. We would, and I think the Indian establishment is trying greater relationship with Japan and other countries. So you will find a lot of that realignment paying dividends for us. We have a huge consumption scenario, but a lot of things on the domestic side in India are not in the most ideal shape, which requires structural internal reforms for our outward projection to make more relevance.
But if you had to speak about how the US rationale behind this, the US argues that tariffs support industrial policy and help revive manufacturing. But in reality, do they build capacity and innovation, or do they just simply distort trade flows?
So, I mean, as I said earlier, there's hardly any sound economic logic that can justify tariffs or just basically what Trump does. The level of eccentricism in his actions make it very difficult to derive any reason or logic. What you can broadly understand is that the US is trying to bring back a lot of capital which has sort of invested itself away from the US markets back into the US. The hope is that jobs can come back in particular sectors, but this is a pipeline dream. In a larger sense, the US has shot itself in its foot pretty badly with the kind of moves it has made. US taking an adversarial position against India is also counterproductive. It's taken an adversarial position against most other countries. Japan did not sort of ratify its recent trade deal. So most of its allies are questioning, and I think the real breakdown here is of trust, which matters as a currency more than anything else in international relations and partnerships. So you would find the US in a precarious position. The problem is, however, last 100 years of crisis history tell us that whenever the US has been in a position of great volatility in terms of its either currency or monetary scenarios, it has led to deeper crises in other parts of the world. And that is where we have to see that where macroeconomic resilience is found. Countries like India, I think, are much more well positioned because our macroeconomic foundation is much more robust than many other countries. But if you look at West Africa, East Africa, many countries are in a high debt position right now. The post-pandemic economies have not recovered to the pre-pandemic levels. So you will see a very long period of what you would see as a deeper recession, or a position where countries will be extremely wary of coming together doing trade, but they will also find reason to align on certain mutual interests. So they will be competing logic to coming together and doing trade.
Do these tariffs signal a systemic shift away from free trade towards a more permanent protectionist era? And if so, how should India navigate through this?
Yeah, so that's correct. We are seeing greater degree of protectionism, and there are cycles of protectionist trade policies that happen after every few decades. Closest example I can think of is the 1970s or early 80s, where you had the US economy facing both inflation and recession at the same time. There was a term in macroeconomics called stagflation that emerged out of that crisis. And you're seeing something similar within the US economy as well. But the move towards protectionist trade policies should only make more countries to look at what they prioritize on and which areas of trade they want to collaborate and partner. In the Indian scenario, I mean, India needs a new industrial policy. We have a huge problem with our land reforms. Labor reforms have not happened as anticipated. We lost a lot of momentum in the last 10 years because we had a political consensus. There is a lot of gain in infrastructural development that has rightly happened. Logistics synchronization. You have regional development in certain areas as part of the Northeast, down south. Where India really needs to focus, and I've sort of said this before as well, is on state-led development, where Indian states have to really be seen as engines of growth because of the nature of diversity and expansion we have. You have some states giving a very good example. Tamil Nadu is achieving very high state development across metrics. It is one of the rare states that has attracted a huge amount of foreign direct investment. Maharashtra has been doing relatively okay in data in the last few years, but there's a lot within. So states have to be really put forth, and I think that's where things may be a little challenging, because India has also seen in a federal structure a break of trust between many states and the center, clearly because of political issues. And that may not work to our advantage. If we put that aside, we really put our head down and work towards the kind of reforms that we need, we might be able to take this in our course of action. My last sort of intervention there would be that if the domestic scenario for countries as large as India are put in order, we have so much capacity to take care of integrative routes in South Asia and Southeast Asia that the world would sort of chase you over rather than we reaching out for the world for trade pacts. And I think that's very important for our market. Yeah.
So with that, sir, we come to an end of this interview. Thank you so much for joining us. I genuinely learned a lot and enjoyed this conversation. I'm sure the viewers did too. So thank you to the viewers. Thank you for joining us in Geopolitics Decoded. Until next time, stay informed, stay curious. Thank you.